couple weeks ago, Magnus Carlsen played in a tournament that chess.com hosts, which is titled Tuesday, and in that tournament he played a lot of the move b4 as white, otherwise known as the Polish opening. After this move, the best move for black is to go e5, and after bishop to b2, black should take this pawn. Now, in this video, I'm going to explain how to play the Polish opening as white, and how to set up a sort of system which is more or less the same each time, so you don't have to study a lot of theory, and the game that Magnus Carlsen played and won with the Polish. Now, in this position, let's look over the best moves. White should take this pawn in the center because now they are equal in material, and black has traded one of their two main center pawns for white's b pawn, which is worse. So black is about to lose their g7 pawn, so they need to protect that with knight to f6. Now, the best move here is potentially knight to f3, just developing. However, with this system we're going to play the move c3, where we force black to play either one of two moves. If black just simply retreats back a single square, we will now play the move g3, and we will continue with our setup. However, if black plays the move bishop to c5, we will continue with the move d4, attacking the bishop, and then after the bishop retreats, say here, we now have a much stronger position as we can retreat the bishop back, develop all our pieces, and we will have a very nice connected center, which will overwhelm black. Now, if black doesn't play either of those moves and instead moves the bishop back to e7, we will then continue by either one of two strategies. You can either potentially develop your knight like this and potentially retreat your bishop, or if you'd like, you can continue with the setup that we're going to set up later with the move g3. Let's look at what happens if you play the move g3 and continue with this setup that does not require a ton of theory. Now, after this, black can either castle or develop. It doesn't really matter. Our plan's going to stay the same either way. Let's say they just castle. We're going to develop our bishop. And then now let's say they attack our own bishop. Now, we don't really want to retreat because there's not a whole lot of space for our bishop to go if they start to attack it. So we're just going to take this and then play the move e3. We're going to move eventually our knight to e2 and then push for d4. And that's the whole game plan. It's very easy to play, and there's not a lot of theory to study here. So if instead of the bishop going to here, and the bishop goes back to a5, to continue with the setup, you want to play again g3, and if they attack or if they castle, it's pretty much the same thing. Let's say they this time just attack the bishop first. We will take, and after queen takes, we are going to just fianchetto the bishop, and then after something like castles, we play again e3 with this setup, which pretty much makes the black bishop kind of useless because it will only be staring at pawns for the opening of the game. And black, there's not a ton for black to do here. They should probably try to push this pawn at some point, bring their rooks to the center, and it's pretty much a balanced game, but white has ideas and black has ideas. You're going to want to move your knight to e2 because this is the best square to prepare pushing. And now let's look at what happens if none of this happens and black plays some totally different things from the opening. Okay, let's say that after b4, your opponent does not play e5 and instead does something like d5. Now, in this position, you will continue to put your bishop on b2 in almost every setup. Here, black say they just develop their knight normally. Now here you want to potentially play a move like e3. So if black ever comes like this, you could potentially pin their knight to their king. If black's most popular move in master games is e6, in which case you can now play b5 if you'd like. The idea of this is to potentially go a4 and create this sort of wedge in black's position. It makes it hard for them to develop their knights, hard for them to sort of attack this because it's defended by your own bishop. And the game will go on like this. You will develop your knight and eventually castle. Your knight can, after potentially playing a4, your knight can come, say black just develops normally, you just play normally also. They castle, you can play a4, and say black tries to just develop their knight. You can go like this, and this setup where you have this very strong b5 pawn, and you will eventually castle. It's very pleasant for you, and you could, you can play something like c4, and it's not very difficult. Now, if they play something like e5, and then play something weird on the next move, like say you go bishop to b2, and they play something like knight to c6, trying to be tricky and protecting their pawn and counter-attacking this pawn, you can just simply, for example, push this pawn, attacking their knight, and all of a sudden their knight has to move somewhere, and say it moves here, trying to not lose this pawn. Then you can simply go here, which will attack their knight, and you defend this pawn because of your light squared bishop. Their knight will have to move, say, here or here, it doesn't really matter, and they will lose a pawn. So if your opponent is not prepared and does something weird like this, you will get a very good position. If your opponent, say, goes like f6, you can do probably one of two things. If you'd like, you can go a3 and just protect this and have a normal fine position. Or if you'd like, there's a gambit where you can play the move e4, which is something Fischer played a long time ago and had a very nice win. The point is that if they take your pawn, you're going to use their bishop and try to punish them for opening up their king with the move f6. You can study this if you'd like. And those are just some of the weird things that black can do. But mostly, if you're not sure what you can do, you can just protect this pawn. You can just develop your bishop and play the game normally. I hope you enjoyed. And now we're going to go on to Magnus Carlsen's portion of this video where we go over his game. Today I'm going to explain a game that Magnus played in Title Tuesday last week. And the game starts with b4, the Polish, e5, bishop to b2, and then takes and takes. Because the bishop is attacking the g7 pawn, his opponent, who's 2600, blocks with the knight. c3, the main move, bishop back, and then g3, fianchettoing the bishop in the future. And after castles, he takes the knight and proceeds to put all of his pawns except for the a2 one on dark squares, so that regardless of where his bishop goes in the future, it will be staring at pretty much nothing. He moves knight to e2 in order to support expanding the center, and it frees up this knight if he ever does decide to move this pawn, because otherwise this pawn would hang. He goes c6 to create this pawn chain that negates the effects of the light squared bishop. Castles, and then bishop to f5. Magnus expands with d4 in the center. His opponent plays knight to d7, and then knight to d2, bishop to d3, and Magnus brings the rooks to the center, potentially pushing. The knight comes out here in order to put more pressure on this pawn, and potentially he will move this pawn or this pawn, and after a couple moves, e4 is played, and after takes, and bishop back, Magnus starts to shuffle his pieces a bit, and eventually gets his knight onto this square, attacking the b7 pawn. The pawn moves, and Magnus first takes the rook on e8, and offers the trade, and if the rook takes, the queen takes, and this knight is definitely not free because of checkmate on the back rank. So they do trade, and then, of course, his opponent does not blunder mate in one and retreats the queen. He moves his knight, they trade bishops, and Magnus realizes that his opponent has a weakness of an isolated pawn on d5 and proceeds to first infiltrate on the a6 square, pressuring these pawns. He then reroutes his knight to pressure the pawn on d5, and then after his opponent plays a5, he attacks the queen, forcing it to move. Then he attacks this pawn, which is, you can't really defend this because there's two pieces attacking it and only the queen can defend. So the queen moves back, but his opponent misses that this pawn is hanging, and his opponent also only has a single second of time left on the clock. There is an increment in this game. His opponent moves the bishop back. Magnus takes another pawn and another pawn. And after check, his king is now safe. And after queen to a1, check, he moves the knight, threatening sorts of checkmates. And after bishop to g7, check with the knight, his king moves, and he's threatening discovered checks. The queen takes the pawn on a4, and after check, check, it's mate. And this was the game, and how Magnus Carlsen won with the Polish opening in Title Tuesday. Now, looking back at the beginning of the game, the main ideas of the Polish are seen were essentially these pawns are traded, and the main idea of taking this knight and then creating this all dark squared pawns in order to negate the effects of the dark bishop, developing the knight to e2, castling, and then expanding in the center are all ideas that are in the Polish opening and that you can try sometime yourself in the future. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe.